So for space practice, this is the easiest one to understand, the most difficult one to implement, in my opinion. So you want to space your practice out over time. For example, with especially if you're dealing with elementary kids and even middle school kids, and even at the high school level, it's kind of hard because of how kind of condensed curriculum is. This is a little bit easier, especially if you're a college student, because with a college student, you may have 3-4 weeks between tests, and so you really need to make sure that you have this space practice. But in at the high school level, just making sure kids get away from this habit of cramming, which is a terrible way to study. If you're going to spend 2 hours studying, you're better off spending that 2 hours spreading it throughout a week and a half than 2 hours the night before the test. And so that's really what space practice is about. Now, the other thing I would say is, like with retrieval practice and having space practice, you want to kind of go back and review and revisit, and you want to space that out. So with retrieval, what you want to try and do is retrieve it, but you want to lengthen the period of times between retrieval. So you may want to try and retrieve it 2 days after you first examine it, and then you want to try and make it a week, and then you want to try and make it 2 weeks, then you want to try and make it. But that's another way of doing this space practice and retrieval practice and kind of combining the two. So again, after a class, you want to have a little bit of a break, but even you can do this within a class day, right? So maybe you have a kid that's doing a lesson, and then they have PE or music or another class, and they come back to you later in the day. That's a good way to then review it. Say, hey, let's go back over and get this out, and let's see if we can kind of re-examine it. The other thing too that you can do is when you go through something new, give them the opportunity to go back and go through something old. And again, that's retrieval practice, but it's also space practice. So when you look at these things, they don't work in isolation from each other. All 6 of these strategies work together. When you really elaborate on your ideas, you try and see the big picture and then figure out how the details fit in there. And then you review it and you space it out. All of those things are really going to help. The other important thing is when you're doing space practice, just rereading your class notes or rereading your book is not space practice. It's not best practice, and it's a terrible study habit. Rereading your class notes and rereading your textbook. Kids like to think that it's effective, and when you look at, for example, retrieval practice, kids like to use that as retrieval practice because it feels good, because as they're reading through, they feel like they remember more. The problem is they're just getting superficial understanding or superficial memory. They're not really getting deep down, and they're not really having to struggle to bring that out of their long-term memory, and so it's not an effective way. So testing yourself, sketching and drawing things out, trying to get as many details down, that's an effective way to do space practice. And the other thing is, you're going to forget information. Kids need to know 48 hours after we go through something, you're going to forget 80% of what you did. And that's okay, because what studies show us is that relearning is much shorter. So when they go back to relearn it, it's going to take them far less time than the first time they had to learn it. And that'll also force you to go back and find this information. It's going to force you to get knowledge of results. This is what I remember. This is what I didn't remember. And that's going to help you actually become stronger and have better memories and learn more. The real difficulty with this strategy is being disciplined enough to make it happen. You got to create your time. You got to carve it out. And so that's one of the things I guess I'm struggling with in my classes. I got to figure out better ways to carve out that time, but not just carve it out, make it useful, and figure out a way to make those kids go back through and do some of that space practice. Because no matter how many times I tell them to do it on their own, most of them are not very good at doing it. So figuring out a way to help them get that in their daily routine is something that would really benefit them. And again, like I said, this is probably something that they really need a lot of scaffolding on, because they're just not willing to do it themselves. It's so much easier to, I guess, put it off and do something else that's a little bit more fun. But it pays big dividends to be able to have this space practice.